Holden could feel Sunburst's legs extend out as it descended into Earth. He gripped the armrests and closed his eyes. He never liked the landing. The ship rattled as it fought against gravity. To distract himself, Holden thought back to the last time he saw Earth. He remembered floating past it on his way to the International Space Station 12 4 years ago. He and his crew were returning from a failed mission where they were supposed to find another planet to inhabit. Sunburst bucked backward, preparing to land softly on solid ground. The legs grabbed hold and the engine whined down. The ship was old, and it showed. Holden opened his eyes and saw that the rest of the crew were already out of their seats and grabbing their gear. He knew they were both nervous and excited about returning to Earth. The ISST government briefed them on the prospect of finding Earth habitable once more, or encountering more of the infected. Holden unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "All right, people. We are to locate Station 244, look for comm survivors, and report what we find back to ISST." The crew of 6 nodded. "Captain, are we to take the survivors back on board Sunburst?" Hernandez said, her hazel eyes fixing on Holden. "No, we're to treat them at the station." "That's a dumb question, Hernandez. They might be infected and could possibly kill you," Zaminsky said. "Eat shit, Zammy. I thought there might be a chance to help instead of kill them." "Stop that. We need to stay focused, because if we don't, some of you might not come back," Holden said, noticing Hernandez and Zaminsky's faces drop. "I don't think there are enough vaccines to treat all the comm survivors," Jean-Baptiste said quietly. "Doc, don't worry about it. What's important is finding out what happened to them and what information they had gathered," Holden said, peering at everyone to ensure they were looking at him. "This is more of a research mission. If we find evidence that the large radius around Station 244 is clear or light on the infected, the ISST government will send our teams to investigate." The crew glanced at each other. Holden and the crew slowed their pace as they reached the Station 244 complex. Station 244 was one of 600 stations across the U.S. All of them were repurposed buildings, such as schools, hospitals, or libraries. Station 244 was a former prison for the state of Florida, the FSC Coleman. It sat in a complex that housed separate parts of the prison, low and medium security. Past survivors would be housed in prison quarters, either in the low or medium prisons. The admin offices were in the middle of the two, which was where Holden and his crew were headed. The crew paused in front of the double doors, staring at the jagged scratch marks. "You think any of the infected got in?" Jean-Baptiste asked. "We're about to find out," Holden said, and beckoned at a couple of the others. "Lazarus and Connolly, get these doors opened." A large man with a buzz cut and a woman with the same cut and ruggedness took hold of a soldering tool and aimed at the doors. A laser streamed out and raced along, creating a square within the frame. As Lazarus and Connolly holstered their tools, the cutout door fell inwards. The booming sound resonated down the shadowy hallway. The crew snatched up their weapons and waited. Nothing moved in the shadows. "All right," Holden said, and he stepped in first. The crew broke out into twos, Holden with Hernandez, Zaminsky with Jean-Baptiste, and Lazarus with Connolly covering the rear. They passed doors that were either closed, half-closed, or open. Not wasting any time entering any of them, the crew stealthily made it to the back, closing doors as they went. The hallway ended in a T. "The comms room is supposed to be down the right hall," Hernandez said, pointing with her chin. They found a door marked as the communications room. Holden paused, holding onto the doorknob. He nodded at the crew and slowly opened the door. The comms room was bigger than Holden expected. Rows of desks huddled in the center, with a few stations rigged with 6 monitors, and most scattered broken on the floor. On the left side was a wide monitor, which Holden assumed was used to screen the communications feeds for everyone to see. There was a faint stench of decay lingering. The crew spread out, sweeping the area. "Captain, you better come look at this," Hernandez said, her face half covered by her weapon. Holden sprinted and stood next to Hernandez. 5 bodies lay haphazardly near each other, face down. Holden swallowed. Each of them wore the same jumpsuit he and the crew wore. "Did the ISST send a crew before us?" Zeminski asked. "Not that I'm aware of," Holden said. Holden took hold of one of the bodies and flipped it over. "What the fuck?" Zeminski said, his weapon lowering. "It looks like you," Hernandez said, watching Zeminski. "No, that's not possible. He almost looks like me," Zeminski said. Zeminski bent down and flipped another. "No. Why does she look like me?" Connolly said, her weapon down. "Keep your weapon up," Holden said. Zeminski began flipping the rest of the bodies. Each one resembled a face from each crew member. 3 of the bodies were mutilated, as though they were attacked by the infected, and 2 of them bullet holes in their abdomens and chests. "JB, how is this possible?" Zeminski said, his voice quivering. I don't know," Jean-Baptiste said. "There must be a time rift or something," Lazarus said. "A what?" Hernandez said. "The ISSF recently discovered what they call a time rift, which is like a bubble where time is either in the past or in the future, and anyone or anything in the present can enter it without knowing it." "But I thought it was happening on one of the discovered planets. It was one of the reasons why we couldn't inhabit it," Hernandez said. Lazarus shrugged. "If Earth has a time rift, then that means—" Jean-Baptiste didn't finish. "We will find a logical explanation, but first we must set up here and find a comms staff," Holden said. The crew nodded and began the routine of setting up surveillance and supplies. Holden hesitated as he stared into the corpse that had his face. With ISST comms set and supplies accounted for, Holden and the crew moved the bodies to the farthest side of the room, careful not to look at their faces. Holden decided to check the other rooms before handling the bodies. He wanted Jean-Baptiste to take a blood sample from each of them, even though he feared what he would find out. Besides clearing the rooms for the infected, they also searched for other bodies. One by one, the rooms were searched. They proved to be mostly empty, except for a couple of infecteds that were exterminated. The crew headed back to the comms room. "I expected to find more bodies," Hernandez said. "Why? Most survivors keep moving. They don't stay anywhere for too long," Lazarus said. "There's nothing around here. It's a prison complex. Survivors would have a better chance of living out of a grocery store than here," Zeminski said. Holden, leading the crew back, stopped in front of the door. "Didn't we close the door?" "Yeah, I was the last one out. I closed it," Connolly said. Everyone stared at the door, which was left ajar. "Sir, I did close the door," Connolly said as she raised her weapon and poked it through the gap. The door swung slowly, halfway opening. The crew waited on Holden. A second passed, and Holden pointed at the opening. Connolly burst through, followed by Lazarus. They fanned out to let the others in. They zipped down each aisle of computer stations. "What the fuck?" Zeminski said. He was standing at the far side of the room. The rest of the crew headed towards him. Each one stared at the floor. Holden crept in and his jaw dropped slightly. "Where did the bodies go?" Connolly asked. Zeminski paced as the rest of the crew sat on office chairs, with their weapons on their laps. Holden leaned against the wall, near the entrance barricaded by office furniture. Food was laid out, but no one was partaking. "They're not dead," Zeminski said for the 13th time. "Zammy, shut up," Hernandez said. Zeminski approached Hernandez. Hernandez rose from her seat to face Zeminski. "All right, stop it, you two," Holden said. Zeminski spun back to his pacing, and Hernandez sat. "Captain, I think we need to find the bodies," Jean-Baptiste said, rubbing his hand over his nearly bald head. I know that, Doc. I'm trying to come up with a plan. We can't all go hunting. That wasn't part of the mission. Holden said, raising his arms and slapping them back down against his thighs. We would have to leave a couple of us here. But that's risky. There's not a whole lot of us, Lazarus said. Exactly, Holden said. We can leave one person here to locate the stats that the comms people found while the rest search, Connolly said, looking at each of them. I could stay since I would have been the one either way. Holden paused, and he could feel the eyes of the others on him, waiting for him to decide. All right, gear up. Connolly will take your suggestion. Keep your communication open and report if you find anything. Holden yanked his jacket from one of the desks as he continued. Barricade yourself after we leave. Don't let anyone in unless you hear this. Holden rapped on the desk once, twice rapidly, and once again. Connolly nodded as she rose from her seat. The others waited near the barricaded entrance. Gradually making their way down one of the hallways, Holden sensed that the temperature in the building had changed, a few degrees cooler than it was earlier. Entering one of the rooms, the crew fanned out, and through one of the cracks in the boarded-up windows, Holden could see that it was twilight. Claire, Zeminski said as he returned from an extra room. They headed out into the hallway again. They searched every room and cleared each one. Holden and the others were in the hallway leading to the front entrance when he noticed something strange. He raised his arm and the others stopped. Slowly they approached the doors. As he peered at the moonlit scene through the door, he could see it rippling as if seeing a disturbed pond. Do you see this? Holden asked. Yes, Hernandez said. I think it's the time rift, Lazarus said. That's what it's supposed to look like? Zeminski asked. I don't know, maybe. Lazarus says. Jesus, we're here going by what you say. I thought you knew about this, Zeminski said. I'm not an expert, goddammit, Lazarus said. This wasn't here when we first entered, was it? Jean-Baptiste asked. Would we have noticed it? Holden said. Connolly, are you there? Hernandez said into her comms. I haven't heard from her for some time, she said to Holden. Holden turned to Hernandez. Dread began to scuttle up his spine. The situation seemed familiar to him. He recalled running an exploratory mission on a remote planet some time ago, where he was stalked and ambushed by a cunning alien species. We need to head back now, Holden said. What about that? Jean-Baptiste asked as he pointed towards the entrance. Don't touch it. We don't know what would happen if we try to go through, Holden said as he began to jog back to the comms room. The comms room door was wide open. Connolly, Hernandez said as she rushed in with the others in tow. Holden took the rear and scanned either side of the hallway before following. For a brief second, he thought he had seen a shadow turning a corner. Inside, the crew searched the room, their weapons dropping and lifting. Lazarus cried out. The others rushed to his side. Jean-Baptiste got to his knees as he pulled off his medipack. Connolly was sputtering blood, and it landed back onto her face. She held what was left of her entrails down into her stomach as she kicked out in agony. Laz, I need you to hold her down, Jean-Baptiste said. Lazarus got down and pinned Connolly's legs. Jean-Baptiste pressed down on Connolly's hands that held her stomach with one hand, and with the other began to spray a medical sealant from one side of her torso to the other. Connolly sputtered. No, don't knock, she said, and she wheezed out her last breath. Holden stared at the covered body of Connolly as the crew bowed their heads in silence. Tears streamed down their hardened faces. No tears stained Holden's face. He had numbed himself from such emotions as a child when the infected killed his family. 30 years later, and he was still continuing his fight against them, with a crew who had also gone through loss, and now with one of their own. Holden realized his hands were in tight fists, and they shook as he released them. "We need to contact the ISST and tell them what has happened," he said without looking up at his crew. Dispersing, the crew secured a room entrance with a furniture barricade. Hernandez stayed behind. "Captain, besides contacting the ISST, what should we do with the other bodies?" she asked. "They're not bodies anymore. They're infected. At this point, we seek and destroy," Holden said, glancing at Hernandez. Her face was mired in horror and grief. He knew he was asking her and the rest of them to hunt down themselves. Even though he didn't know much about the time rift, he felt that it was affecting the environment in Station 244. They were all here once, and something terrible had happened to them. "This mission is compromised," Holden said loudly. The others stopped. "We are to report to the ISST and get permission to return." "Does that mean?" Zaminsky started. "Earth is not livable," Holden said. Hernandez sat at the central communication station, with the rest of the crew standing behind her. Lazarus leaned on the desk next to her, pointing a weapon at the entrance. Holden watched as green text scrolled onto the screen. Hernandez and Connolly were among the few remaining explorers familiar with the old plane communication system. Her slim fingers tapped across the wide keyboard and then paused. "The comms team kept a log," Hernandez said. "Pull it up," Holden said. Hernandez opened a folder labeled Last Log. "It's strange that they named it the last log. The logs are supposed to be numbered. There should be 11 years' worth of logs here." "It probably was intentional," Lazarus said. They read silently as the lanterns illuminating the space ticked in the background. Zaminsky left the crew's side and groaned. "They left. I can't believe it. Aren't they supposed to get approval from one of the ISS to do that?" Hernandez said. Holden nodded. "Maybe they were driven out by the infected," Jean-Baptiste said. "Or the time rift." Lazarus said. "This is bullshit," Zaminsky said. "Can it, Zammy? This is not the time," Hernandez said. "Fuck off." Hernandez jumped up, the chair knocking back. Holden tried to grab hold of Hernandez as she brushed past him. She rushed at Zaminsky, her face only a few inches from his. He shoved her, and she bounced back with a hard push. "Still don't know how to cope, huh, Zammy? You're a pussy." "Fuck you, Hernandez. At least I have my head on straight and wouldn't accidentally kill someone." "Stop," Jean-Baptiste said. Holden noticed Lazarus watch with disinterest as he pointed his gun not at the entrance but at Hernandez and Zaminsky. Hernandez drew back her shoulder and released a punch, landing on Zaminsky's jaw. Holden and the rest of the crew rushed over. "Hernandez, can you get through to ISST?" Holden asked as he stood between her and Zaminsky. Hernandez nodded and gave a quick glance to Zaminsky. She headed back to Central Comm Station. "Zaminsky, go have yourself a meal in a corner somewhere," Holden said. Zaminsky scowled as he brushed past Jean-Baptiste, who was trying to staunch the blood from Zaminsky's cut lip. Holden paused in front of Lazarus. "Why were you pointing your weapon at them?" Lazarus took hold of Holden's eyes with his and said, "Because the time rift might be changing people." After being on hold for about 15 minutes, the ISST military commander-in-chief responded. Her voice boomed through the speaker. Holden was surprised that the commander herself was communicating. He had expected one of the lieutenants. "Let's get this straight. The comm staff have left Station 244? The commander said. "Yes, Commander. According to the last log entry here, they had left a few months ago," Holden said. "That would explain why we haven't gotten communications from them for that period." There was a pause, and the commander continued. "With the possibility of the infected still prevalent and emerging time rift, this mission is compromised. I know this comes as a blow, knowing that you all have lost a crew member." "Does this mean we have permission to return to the ISST?" Holden asked. A long silence. Hernandez glanced at Holden. "Connolly's body has to stay." A sharp cry from Lazarus interrupted the commander. As for the rest of you, if any of you have been bitten by an infected or touched a time rift, you can't come back." "None of us have been bitten, and we haven't touched a time rift," Holden said. "What happens if we touched a time rift?" Hernandez said. "That's classified," the commander said. "Probably get scrambled or die," Zeminski mumbled. "I suggest you hurry. Once I mention this to the president, there won't be much time left for you all to leave," the commander said. The line went dead. Holden gripped the door handle to the comms room tightly. He peered at his crew. They faced the door with their weapons pointed. They had gathered everything they needed and had covered Connolly's body with a medic blanket. He was about to turn the knob when he heard a rustling sound. The others spun towards the area the sound came from. Connolly's body rose from between two desks, the blanket gradually slipping from its face, snarling a dash towards them. Holden turned the knob and burst through the door, the rest following closely behind. Going down a corridor, he noticed the office doors were wide open again. An unease settled in his stomach as he swung his weapon left and right. Turning a corner, they headed down the main hallway. Holden could see the entrance to the building, but he couldn't see if the rippling was there. Assuming that the time rift didn't cover the whole area, they would attempt to go through the wide windows next to the entrance. Passing one of the office doors, Holden heard screeching. It burst through the threshold and grabbed hold of Zeminski. Zeminski twisted and tried ramming the butt of his weapon onto its skull. The others fanned out, trying to find a shot. Holden realized that the infected was one of the bodies they had found. It was Zeminski. "I don't know who to shoot," Lazarus said. More screams erupted from where they had come from. Holden peered down the hall and saw the rest of the crew racing towards them. Gunshots rang out, and one of them struck Zeminski. Hernandez staggered back as the infected Zeminski reared back and lunged at her. The other Zeminski lay dying. "Move out," Holden said. Backpedaling as they continued to gun down the infected, the crew reached the opening. "I don't see the rippling. Let's go," Holden said. One by one, they dashed through the double doors, racing across the open space and in between the buildings. Holden peered back to see a couple of the infected tailing them. Switching on their flashlights on their gun scope, the crew followed the bouncing light. "Sunburst is ahead about 300 feet, Hernandez said. Jean-Baptiste heard it first. "Do you hear that?" He had slowed down. A dark form tackled him down, and he screamed. The crew beamed their flashlights where Jean-Baptiste was last seen. On top of him were a pair of wild dogs. They took turns taking bites out of his torso as blood cascaded upwards. Another appeared from the darkness and growled at them. "We need to keep going," Hernandez said as she yanked at Holden. Holden could see Sunburst's back hatch opening as they continued racing. Stumbling in, Hernandez got to the cockpit first and started the engines. The craft lifted into the air like an elevator. Holden sat next to Hernandez and strapped himself in as Lazarus sat behind them. Sunburst gradually pierced the thin layer of space as it got into orbit. Holden felt himself breathe, and he closed his eyes. Something tickled in the back of his mind, making him feel different, as if he didn't feel like himself. Holden thought back to the escape and wondered if he had noticed that the time rift was gone where the double doors had stood. Confusion clouded his mind. He opened his eyes and saw Hernandez was staring blankly at him. Holden turned in his seat to look at Lazarus and was stunned to see the whole crew strapped in. Thank you for listening to the Chillingly Bizarre podcast. For bonus content, check out chillinglybizarre.com. This was Season 2, Episode 13, titled Station 244, and it was written by JDW. The episode was narrated by JDW. All characters were voiced by JDW. Credits go to freesound.org and its following contributors: Johnny Farmer, Joseph Pujol, Ed Harka, Wasabi Wilder, Indigo Ray, Simon Fo 1, Hey Har, Shots, Point Park Cinema, Time 515, Mr. Han, Dos Santos Barbosa, Zigvari, Tonsil 5, Sonorius Genius, Junior Mythical, Ryan King Art, Bus Error, Daniel SFX, and Tia Gus Silva 37. Please leave a review on Spotify app or anywhere else you listen to the podcast.